So those are all of the locations in Westeros that existed during the Long Night. The obvious question that not enough news sites are even bothering to ask, disturbingly, is, will the Long Night prequel actually show anything outside of Westeros? We have no guarantee of that. Will it even show any of Westeros outside of the North? We have no idea. We have zero hint that Old Town would appear in it at all just because it happens to exist at the time. Or they're going to weave together Casterly Rock and Storm's End into a story about the Long Night. I mean, they could, and there might even be a good way to do that. But you could tell this whole story just in the lands around Winterfell in the north. I don't know how much of the whole continent was involved in that. How could they? But we have no confirmation, at least. It's the fact that people aren't just theorizing or making wish lists, but that they're treating it as if it's confirmed. It really gets to me that the way that theorization has worked these days, and also with things in like Season 8, where not just I think this will happen, I know this will happen because I want it. That when did our critical thinking take that much of a hit? So now, mostly just for the sake of thoroughness and to inform everyone as much as possible, I'm going to go over all the locations and cultures that existed outside of Westeros during the Long Night that we know of. And reflecting that point I'm trying to make, I broke them up into two categories of, first, locations and peoples that were mentioned in the TV show, that appeared in the TV show, and then a second grouping of places that never appeared in the TV show, so this isn't a draw, it's actually problematic to introduce these places for a prequel that's really playing on people's nostalgia as its major selling point. Well, first and foremost, Valyria. A lot of people are asking about this. Valyria only discovered and learned to ride dragons 5,000 years ago, 1,000 years after the Age of Heroes ended, and 3,000 years after the Long Night. They're just a backwater of humble shepherds now. They're just hill tribes. They're nothing. And so many people just, they're playing it fast and loose and don't really care. That yes, we don't know the exact dating. The Long Night could have been only 6,000 years ago, and the Andal invasion 4,000 years ago. Some people point out, maybe the internal history is wrong. In universe, people point out we don't really know, because it's an age of legends. Nonetheless, 3,000 years is a long time, and I've seen actual mainstream news sites posting, oh, well, it's 5,000 years ago, 8,000 years ago. It's close enough that it was probably fudging the numbers a little. There was probably some overlap, and anything within 1,000 years that long ago, I'd actually be saying yes to you. But 3,000 years is generally accepted, and just the legends don't speak of it as happening right after the Long Night. It happens so much later that it doesn't really seem that way. And even then, that's just what we know from the books. On top of that, now this is official. So many people are saying, there shouldn't be Valyrians in it. There shouldn't be dragons in it. No, you're wrong. Well, this is reality. Officially, Martin has said, there are no dragons in the Long Night prequel project. And you had no reason to assume there would be. It was last November when he was going around the interview circuit for the release of Fire and Blood, and he said in a couple of interviews, this one with Bustle.com, look at the headline. The Game of Thrones prequel, Long Night, won't include Targaryens or dragons, according to George R.R. Martin. That's pretty cut and dry, guys, that he said Westeros is a very different place. There's no King's Landing. There's no Iron Throne. There are no Targaryens. Valyria has hardly begun to rise yet with its dragons and the great empire that it built. We're dealing with a different and older world, and hopefully that will be part of the fun of the series. And further, in a separate interview that week in the New York Times, He said, it's set thousands of years before Game of Thrones. King's Landing does not exist. The Iron Throne does not exist. There are no dragons there. Just how far have we fallen that he has to explain to people King's Landing doesn't exist 8,000 years ago. It was made 300 years ago. Do you even watch this show? I mean, people watching the show attentively could have picked up on that. I think most people casually watching the show actually did pick up on that there was Aegon's conquest, that this was... They mentioned it fairly prominently in Season 7, actually. It was a bit of an exposition-heavy scene, but saying, well, Torrhen Stark surrendered to Aegon the Conqueror. They've mentioned Aegon the Conqueror enough that it wasn't 8,000 years ago. And it's just people hoping for what they want. To the point of it's self-delusion. Like, I think of it like people who are upset after Season 6 that Brienne didn't do much, and you've seen these people saying they didn't just hope, but they knew that, well, you know, Brienne's going to get a lot to do in Season 7. Well, what makes you say that? Because she has to. Because the perfect show wouldn't let us down. That I'm really just seeing people in denial that HBO picked the 1 out of 4 prequel pitches that doesn't have any dragons in it. And it's just so shocking and illogical to them that the phrase I'm looking for is does not compute. Just does not compute. They can't comprehend they do something this silly. And this is the one prequel that wouldn't have dragons in it. Out of like Targaryen Conquest or Dance of the Dragons, there would always be some in most of these, even in the background. And this is the one prequel that would have the least reason to have dragons in it. Barring something set after the death of the dragons, of course, like Dunk and Egg. I don't count that because he stated they're not doing Dunk and Egg. But I mean, of the ones that we're reasonably sure that were pitched so far, like a Valyria prequel, Dance of the Dragons, Targaryen Conquest, just the prequel that very probably would only have events set in Westeros. And I've seen some people arguing, oh, maybe you could get one from a Shy, and we know there are wild dragons. That was grasping at straws. Martin here said, there are no dragons in it. And please, don't launch into something in the comments section that even if you wanted them to fudge the rules and work in a dragon anyway, they're not going to. For good or ill. I actually think that would be sillier. And if you wanted a dragon in it that much, why aren't you picking a different prequel era? But people have seen this, have actually showed to on Twitter and stuff, have finally given up and said, this was pretty clear. I don't blame them for saying, well, maybe they could work in something with a Shy. You could plausibly, but it's hard to interpret this differently, what Martin says in the New York Times one, that there are no dragons. This isn't some surprise they're going to do. The Targaryens aren't in it. So, first, recognizable locations and cultures. Valyria isn't in it, which, tangent, that means there aren't any dragons in it. Next, because the Long Night is thousands of years before the Valyrians built their empire, unquestionably, the Free Cities do not exist either. I mean, Valyria doesn't exist as what we think of as Valyria. You'd point it and go, there's some humble hill tribe shepherds. It doesn't exist as this dragon empire. It's not really there. The Free Cities, there's nothing. Physically, they wouldn't exist. They weren't built by the Valyrians yet. So, in the world of the books and even the TV series narrative, these are the cultures closest to Westeros physically, so you encounter more of them, these 9 distinct cultures. In the TV show, we saw 3 of them, but Braavos, major recurring location, unique culture, it's kind of like Venice, does not exist at all. They were founded by slaves who escaped from Valyria, but in reaction to Valyria, they wouldn't be there. They were founded after Valyria was founded. Pentos, which we didn't see quite as much of, but pretty prominently in the first season, there was big introduction. Pentos does not exist. And Volantis, first and oldest of the Free Cities, Volantis does not exist. Which was only in 2 episodes, but I thought, with the impressive CGI design in the bridge, that was pretty prominent, it was pretty memorable. That isn't there either. Or characters came from some of the free cities to Westeros, like Dario Naharis's Tiroshi. You could have a Kohorok blacksmith or something. That all of those, not just locations, but characters from the locations, the cultures themselves don't exist yet. So you couldn't have a character like Thoros of Myr, or I'm thinking of Season 1, where even though we didn't see Braavos, we saw Syrio Forel. You wouldn't even have someone visiting from these locations. They're not there. So Valyria, not in it. The free cities don't exist. What about the Dothraki? Physically do not exist either. The Dothraki only migrated west of the massive Bone Mountains to settle in the grasslands, which are now the Dothraki Sea, around 1,000 years ago. Well, sometimes the numbers vary. Some people say maybe 5,000. It was long after the Long Night. It was certainly not as long ago as that. I mean, they were, all the peoples migrating and bubbling around the other continents beyond the edge of the map, we don't know, but they would be well beyond the edge of any known map, and they wouldn't really be like the Dothraki of today, whatever precursor tribe was there. Even if the story would go to that far east in Essos, I don't see why it would. So the Dothraki are not that old of a race. They don't exist pretty much in the Long Night. Qarth exists on some level, actually. If Qarth itself does not, their ancestors, the Cathy, do. The World Book explains this, that they lived in other cities in the central plains of Essos, later left in ruins, and they warred with the Sarnori and the Dothraki, and they got pushed out by the Sarnori into the southeast, which later turned into that desert, the Red Waste, and Qarth was their only colony city that survived, but because it was on the fringe, it escaped the Dothraki, and then it got wealth from the sea, and it turned more powerful than all their other cities ever were. But their ancestors, the Cathy, explains how they were around. So, they talk about mysteries of the East in the description of this show. If you had, like, a character show up saying, I'm a Cathy warlock, that's fine. Tying into, oh, yeah, we saw the warlocks of Qarth in the TV show. That's entirely plausible to have. I'm thinking of a group of characters from the East or something, and, like, have one of them say, I'm a Qarthy warlock or something. That's doable. But how much of a draw is Qarth to TV-only viewers? It was only in Season 2. That was a long time ago, but not... And Season 1 was also a long time ago, but it benefits from that's the one everyone starts in. I don't think people remember a lot of stuff that happened in, like, Season 2 or even Season 3 when they burn through it. You remember the first season because it's what really burns into your memory, and then the most recent seasons. But even what I'm saying is Qarth wasn't that prominent. It wasn't that prominent in the books either, but they really pared it down relative to that. It's not much like it was in the books. And it just never really clicked with a lot of people. Even in the books, as a book fan, I actually kind of like it, of just this exotic East location with all these jewels and spices and things and magic. It's kind of like India, kind of like Carthage. It's a fantasy construct, but it would be interesting to me, but I don't really see a big fan following for Qarth among the TV viewers. And it wasn't that prominent relative to Slaver's Bay. So, Slaver's Bay, in contrast, definitely existed. The Giscari Empire was already old when young Valyria was still herding sheep. With all the pyramids and stuff, it's sort of like ancient Egypt. They're the only civilization that can reliably be said to have begun before the Long Night, slightly before. They say it started like a generation before that, barely survived and went through. Accounts vary. It's something like, it's a rivalry between them and Yiti, which is like China, of who's older, and, well, define older, that, well, we were a civilization then, but our continuous written civilization in Yiti isn't as dateable compared to, they can date written records reasonably well in Giscari. I'm arguing over semantics here, but they're really old. They're possibly the first civilization, that the oldest continuous one that survives. So the Giscari Empire would be around then. And then I'm specifically thinking of the news sites listing off, we'll see the Giscari Empire. you're just listing off things that happen to exist then without thinking out, is there a story reason for them to be interlinked, or is there fan demand for that? Like, what sense would it make to see the Giscari? You're just listing off what could exist then, grasping at straws, scraping the bottom of the barrel. How much of a draw is Slaver's Bay to TV-only fans? I mean, people remember it more than Karth. A common complaint is that it was a tangent preventing Daenerys from returning to Westeros, and not very interesting. I disagree on both, because book Slaver's Bay is a lot more developed. I am interested in book Slaver's Bay, and you understand if you haven't read those, they cut a lot out. I mean, think of how many named characters from Slaver's Bay we actually met. I mean, from the local Giscari, not slaves taken from elsewhere like Missandei or Grey Worm. Really just Hisdar. And there's all, actually in the book, there's all these internal politics and cultural details which are interesting. And for starters, with the whole, it's keeping Dany from returning to Westeros, I really like that essay by that fan essay by the Myronese Blot, which Martin himself has cited as they got it, that, no, it's about how peace is difficult and character growth for Daenerys, and I actually really appreciate it more because of that. That, no, this had story purpose for why it was there, and their culture is more interesting the more detail there is in the books. So, I would be interested in seeing the Giscari Empire. I don't know if TV-only viewers would. It's hard for me to remove that from my mind, from my experience. I can't have the mental experience of a TV-only viewer who is paying attention but just plain wasn't shown much impressive about Slaver's Bay, any more than is someone only watching the TV show and you're trying to tell them Book Dorn is actually really good. How would they know? Obviously, even Book Slaver's Bay isn't as good as Book Dorn, just due to focus. Dorn gets its own POV characters, but would the Giscari even have contact with Westeros? The bigger question of would people outside of Westeros even be in this show, and why would they be there? And they don't really have a legend pertaining to the Long Night that's mentioned by name, at least in the World Book. So, I would enjoy it if you saw that, but then that brings up the core issues of would they even be there? And last of the things we kind of saw in the show was Asshai by the Shadow. Asshai was always there. They claim since the dawn of time that in neighboring civilizations, when you look at their oldest written histories, they just go, they talk about Asshai as if it was already there. No one remembers a time when Asshai was not already bordering them. This city of sorcerers. And legends about Azor Ahai, the prince that was promised, actually come from the Lord of Light religion in the East, so there is implied to be some sort of connection. There would be a story reason for some sort of connection in a show. So it does make sense that Asshai, people of Asshai, might appear in the Long Night. But the Game of Thrones TV series never actually depicted Asshai, the location, on screen. So, would TV-only fans care about seeing Asshai? I don't know if they actually mentioned Asshai by name that much. I mean, book fans would be excited, be very excited. But book fans have, again, by the same token, been turned off by later Game of Thrones seasons. The whole, anyone informed enough to know what that is doesn't trust you anymore, and anyone trusting enough isn't informed. So, actually, a few sites have been assuming that they did use the phrase Mysteries of the East means we will definitely see Asshai, the physical location. We don't know that. The point I was saying is, by that logic, Melisandre appeared in Game of Thrones. Did that automatically mean we saw Asshai in it? I mean, she's from Asshai, we never saw the city. But still, I actually think it's more important to have a character from a place than, like, Volantis. We didn't really have any major characters from. Tyrion just wandered through it in one episode. It would have greater impact, have like a recurring Valentine character as his troop of companions heads to Meereen. So I think it's more important if a character from Ashai is in it. A Melisandre-like character. So a sorcerer or sorcerers from Ashai might visit Westeros and be prominent in the storyline. I actually think something along those lines will be happening. So we have Karth, Giscari Empire, and Ashai are things that might be around, or the cultures that they descend from. And those three things, I don't know how much of a draw any of the first two are. And Ashai would be nice, but it's so far away. The only thing I can really think of is have a Melisandre-like character from places that the audience is invested in. And even if they don't know the name Ashai, you can point out, I think reasonably enough, people will go, oh, Melisandre's people. And they'll know what that is. But, other category, would locations and groups beyond Westeros, which are not seen in the main TV series, be much of a draw to TV-only fans? When the entire point is double down on hooking back those big TV-only audiences. So I'm going to quickly go over other groups that existed at this time, that we know existed at this time. You plausibly could say they were physically there, but run into the issue of they're not a draw for the returning audience. So it's self-defeating. That if you really wanted to, well, let's go with entirely new stuff, then why didn't we pick one of the other prequel ideas? So, other groups. The Andals at this time were living in the northern parts of what are now the Free Cities, and the Rhoynar, ancestors of the Dornishmen, were in the south of them, of where the Free Cities are. But they're in their infancy, and while you could have, like, a Rhoynar water wizard plausibly visit Westeros, they're not that far away, would that be a draw to TV-only fans? And I don't really think they would. We have no reason to think they would. Bigger issue, I think, than that, I don't really think they'd be a draw, Andals or Rhoynar, is, of course, the Summer Islands, which a lot of people, including me, would really like to see, either see them or characters from there very prominently. The Summer Isles, they definitely exist in this time period. We know they were around since the Dawn Age, and they have been thriving since the Long Night, albeit isolated. They said they only started expanding after ships of the Giscari Empire accidentally wandered to their shores, and they realized, oh, there's lands outside of our archipelago. Let's build fleets and explore and trade and things. So they were a bit isolated, but we have conflicting reports on that I'll explain in a minute. But they've been around since the Dawn Age. No one knows how they got there. They were just always there. Whatever migration isn't remembered. It's a lot like Wakanda, really. It's this thriving Africa-inspired paradise, bits of Caribbean, bits of Indonesia in there, but it's these African city-states in an island chain, and they're very nice. And the problem is, while they're an interesting culture from the books, they're barely mentioned in the TV show compared to the novels. TV-only fans wouldn't know what that is. They never appeared, and we didn't really see characters from there who prominently said, I'm a Summer Island. I'm coded as a Summer Islander, dressed like them, and talking about their culture. There was like one or two things where they race-swapped people in Season 2, which wasn't a bad idea in and of itself. It's just, okay, having Xaro be ethnically a Summer Islander and dressed like a Karth person, or Salador being ethnically Summer Islander, but he's dressed like a man living in Lys, which is one of the Free Cities. They're not presenting as Summer Islanders the culture. And if you mention the name Summer Islander to TV viewers, my point is, they wouldn't know what that is from watching Salador, who never uses that term. And it's not how he dresses or acts. So, like Grey Worm, they said, in passing, I don't think people picked up on this, oh, he's ethnically a Summer Islander, but he was taken in a slaver raid as a baby from their ships, which happens a lot. Slavers take people from everywhere, but we didn't see culturally a Summer Islander person when there are a lot of characters that we missed from the books. Like Chitaya actually owns the high-end brothel where King Robert went, and she interacts with Tyrion, and various soldiers and sellswords who they're the best archers in the entire world, and that you meet in the Free Cities. And the big one is Samwell Tarly books passage on the Cinnamon Wind to get from the Wall to Braavos to Old Town on his trip there. He starts in Braavos with them, then goes to Old Town, and the Cinnamon Wind traveled all over the world. They went, in Book 2, they saw Daenerys in Karth, then they travel to Braavos, meet Samwell, then go to Old Town with him. And, well, the books themselves never went to the Summer Isles. That's how he worked it in, that Samwell spends a chapter on their ship, and they talk about what the Summer Isles are like and their views on life and love. So all of that was cut, and it was really detrimental in my mind, because you're cutting out one of the few really good African-inspired races in this. But talking about plot mechanics, was their civilization present in their homeland? Yes, they were around in the Summer Isles. Would they be seen in Westeros? Well, that's actually an interesting question, because there's points in the World Book where Martin contradicted himself, because he wrote a lot of material, and it was a lot to smooth over, and these are minor points compared to, like, wars in Westeros. The World Book explained that Summer Islander ships have been visiting Old Town since the Dawn Age. Possibly before the quote-unquote first men. There's this whole section going, well, more than a few maesters actually think that the first human beings to set foot in Westeros were Summer Islanders. Explorers and traders and fishermen, that they just didn't stay. Because, well, the first beings to set foot there were, of course, the children of the forest and the giants, non-human races. But, the Summer Islanders are expert seamen and navigators with these far-flung fleets, which eventually would get pretty close to Westeros and far from home. So it's theorized that Old Town, which is this natural good harbor at the mouth of a river, that Old Town might have begun as an outpost for Summer Islander fishing ships to take on fresh water and trade with the children of the forest. I don't know how much trade they could do. I envision something like, hey, these are your lands, but if you let us come on and take on barrels of fresh water, we'll leave behind some barrels of fresh-caught fish for you, and in return you won't bother us. Something like that. Or maybe they traded for obsidian because it's cool. It's a running theory among, even book fans of, if you said, oh, this is a Summer Islander fishing ship visiting the coast of what became the North, it wasn't implausible. It wouldn't be implausible to say, oh, this is the ancient Long Night North, and here's where White Harbor will be. And, oh, our character runs into a fishing village where there's a visiting ship of Summer Islanders. You could do that. Plausibly, it wouldn't wreck the storyverse. Because they are far-traveled people. They're the merchant sea people. But, while you could do that, the Summer Isles were barely mentioned in the main TV series. Best case scenario, would try to cameo them like this. You would try to cameo them like this. But would HBO? Another obvious issue is that they're not the East. I saw so many news sites reading into that line, Mysteries of the East, that automatically will see all of these lands outside of Westeros. That I said with a shy, we might get someone from a shy, that doesn't mean we'll see a shy. But some of them even extended it to saying, Mysteries of the East, that means we'll automatically see the Summer Isles. And the Summer Isles are south of Westeros. They're the south, not the east. That doesn't refer to them, so that's a point against that they'd be in it. Also, they're not really mentioned as part of the Azor Ahai legend, which is in a lot of parts of Eastern Essos, like Irkun the Hero and the Legends of Yiti and stuff, and Azor Ahai from Ashai, that they seem to have just been isolated during all of this, that they weren't involved, or at least if they invent something, it would be an invention. It's not mentioned in the World of Ice and Fire. And on that note of Mysteries of the East, final entry in this, last place I'm going to talk about, is Yiti, in the far east on the northern shores of the Jade Sea, east of Karth. Yiti is a massive, thriving ancient civilization. Yiti is their world's version of Imperial China. That Martin has said this, that it's basically China, and it's where you would find ethnically East Asian people. They're the oldest continuous civilization in the world, because, the Giscari got wiped out by the Valyrians. Yiti is still going strong, that their current civilization began right after the Long Night, and has been around for 8,000 years by the time of the War of the Five Kings. They're older than the Valyrians. But it's this whole, are they older or are the Giscari older? That, well, they have these legends that there used to be an even grander empire before the Long Night, but it collapsed. Civilization got reset to zero, our written records are destroyed. But, we say, well, culturally, we're the descendants of the legendary Empire of the Dawn, when emperors warred with gods and lived 1,000 years, whereas I think as the Giscari have a more accurate written record that, no, we were around before the Long Night. They got wiped out a few thousand years later, though, so Yiti is older than any civilization ever. So they're still very impressive. But credit where credit is due. Point is, and this is the last point here, there's all of these legends it talks about in the World of Ice and Fire about a great empire of the dawn in Yiti before the Long Night. And you probably see a lot of discussion about this when people are theorizing on a Long Night TV show, just because it's one of the few things that's a narrative event we have to go on if you read the Long Night 2-page chapter in the World of Ice and Fire. But in Yiti, there was this great empire of the dawn before the Long Night, and in their legends, they say the Long Night happened as a punishment from the gods when an emperor usurped and murdered his sister, that she was the empress, and he murdered her, seized the throne, and he became the Bloodstone Emperor because he worshipped a meteorite that fell from space. And, it's a riff on there was a Roman emperor who did that. And he conducted blood sacrifices on top of that, which are unspeakable and dark magic, so the gods punished humanity for their wickedness by sending the Long Night. Which is an interesting narrative. We don't know how much that would connect with Westeros. So just 2 points to answer that. We have zero evidence this will appear in the prequel itself. You would put that into your best-case scenario version of a Long Night TV show. That doesn't mean they will. And so far, we have seen no evidence of that. I don't see how it would connect to Westeros. Martin never intended to set a narrative here linking all of these legends. And more importantly, and I'll leave you on this note of, trust but verify, quite simply, we're getting major casting announcements now. We got 12 people now. And none of the cast members announced so far are East Asian. Nor are any of the uncast roles from the casting sheets. The instant we get a major casting of a lot of East Asian people, I'll make an update video talking about, maybe we will see E.T. in this. But there's just Caucasian people and African black people are all they cast, and there's one person described as looking mixed race. I talked about this in the characters video. There aren't really any Latino characters in it, and no Asian characters at all, really. So we have no evidence to think Yi-Ti would be in it. They might be minor secondary characters they visit at some point or something. I don't know what that plan is, but on the level of POV characters, core characters on the level of the Starks and Lannisters, that isn't going to be that big of a thing. Just all evidence seems to be pointing away from that. There's nothing to indicate that, to point in that direction. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they'll do something insane and unbelievable, like pull a Shyamalan and have all of the Yi-Ti people played by white actors, or white actors in yellowface. That would destroy a couple of careers. I'm not saying they're doing that. So we have no reason to think Yi-Ti will be in this. And not that I'm blaming them on that one part, you wouldn't put Yi-Ti in this. It's too hard to fit in. I seriously think we're just getting the North and a Melisandre-like set of characters from Ashai visiting them to fight the White Walkers. Other than that, if you wanted a more diverse cast, you should have picked one of the other prequels, which was openly promising racial diversity. What did you expect from a Long Night prequel other than ancient Winterfell when it's a ring fort?